In 1572, a Quechua woman named Beatriz Mamani stood before Spanish colonial judges in Cusco, accused of using supernatural powers to harm Spanish settlers. Her trial records survive today, but what makes her case extraordinary is not her guilt or innocence. It is the strange fact that she described practices that Spanish authorities themselves had brought to the Americas decades earlier. This paradox reveals a hidden story. The Spanish conquest did not simply impose European witchcraft beliefs on indigenous peoples. Instead, a complex exchange occurred where colonial fears and indigenous traditions merged in unexpected ways, creating entirely new forms of supernatural accusation that would haunt the Andes for centuries. Before Spanish ships reached the Americas, Andean peoples already had complex beliefs about supernatural power. The Inca state had its own specialists who could heal or harm through ritual knowledge. These practitioners worked within clear social structures. They served communities and answered to established authorities. Their powers were understood as part of the natural order, not as evil forces opposing God. Spanish conquistadors arrived with their own supernatural fears. Medieval Europe had long struggled with beliefs about witches, demons, and black magic. The Catholic Church had spent centuries defining what counted as proper Christian practice versus dangerous heresy. When Spanish priests began converting Andean peoples, they brought these anxieties with them. The collision of these two systems created confusion. Spanish authorities expected to find familiar patterns of witchcraft. What they encountered instead was something entirely different. Indigenous practitioners used techniques that seemed magical to European eyes. They worked with plants, invoked ancestral spirits, and claimed to communicate with supernatural forces. Spanish observers often could not distinguish between traditional healing and what they considered dangerous sorcery. This confusion became dangerous. Spanish colonists feared the unknown. They worried that indigenous peoples might use supernatural powers against them. These fears were not baseless. Many indigenous communities did resist Spanish rule through various means. Some turned to spiritual practices as forms of resistance. Spanish authorities began to see supernatural threat everywhere they looked. Francisco Pizarro landed in 1532 with dreams of gold and glory. He did not arrive expecting to become an expert on indigenous supernatural beliefs. Yet, within months of establishing Spanish control, his men began reporting strange occurrences that would shape colonial policy for generations. Crops failed in some areas, despite favorable weather conditions. Spanish soldiers fell ill with no clear cause, suffering from fevers and weakness that resisted European medical treatments. Livestock died suddenly, sometimes entire herds collapsing within hours. Local people whispered about powerful shamans who could influence these events through supernatural means. The earliest documented case occurred in 1533, when Pizarro's own secretary, Pero de Candia, fell gravely ill after consuming native food. Spanish chroniclers recorded that local healers claimed they could cure him through ritual practices. When Candia recovered after indigenous treatment, Spanish soldiers began to fear the power of these practitioners. One soldier wrote in his diary that the healers spoke to invisible spirits and made the sick men well through words alone. This early encounter established a pattern that would repeat throughout the colonial period. Spanish chroniclers recorded these early encounters with wonder and fear, creating detailed accounts that reveal their European framework for understanding. Pedro Cieza de León, who arrived in Peru in 1540 and spent decades documenting indigenous customs, wrote extensively about what he witnessed. In his Chronicle of Peru, completed in 1551, Cieza de León described indigenous healers as individuals who could cure diseases with herbs and words that the devil taught them. He specifically noted that these practitioners would gather certain leaves and roots, and speaking over them with strange ceremonies, they would make remedies that worked beyond natural understanding. Cieza de Leon's language reveals the Spanish framework for understanding indigenous practices. They saw these customs through the lens of European demonic belief, shaped by centuries of medieval Christian theology about witchcraft and sorcery. They assumed that any effective supernatural practice must come from the devil, as they could not comprehend how indigenous peoples achieved healing results without Christian prayer or European medical knowledge. This assumption became a foundational element of colonial policy toward indigenous spiritual practices. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, another early chronicler, provided even more detailed observations in his General and Natural History of the Indies, published in 1547. Oviedo wrote that indigenous healers possess knowledge that seems to come from the devil himself, for they can stop bleeding, cure fevers, and make the lame walk again through their ceremonies. He described witnessing a ritual where a shaman blew over a sick man while chanting in his native tongue, and the man recovered within hours. Oviedo's account shows how Spanish observers attributed effectiveness to demonic rather than medical causes. The reality was far more complex than Spanish observers understood. Andean healers used extensive knowledge of local plants and medical techniques that had been developed over centuries. They understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plant species, including cinchona bark, source of quinine, coca leaves, and numerous other healing herbs. They combined practical healing with spiritual ritual, recognizing that psychological factors played important roles in recovery. Their effectiveness came from real medical knowledge, careful observation, and systematic application of traditional techniques, not supernatural power. Spanish observers lacked this understanding due to fundamental differences in medical knowledge and cultural perspective. European medicine of the 1530s was still largely based on ancient Greek theories about bodily humors. Spanish physicians had little experience with New World diseases, plants, or environmental conditions. They could not distinguish between effective indigenous treatment and what they considered dangerous sorcery. This ignorance led them to attribute indigenous medical success to demonic influence rather than superior knowledge. The first recorded execution for witchcraft in the Andes occurred in 1541, just 9 years after Pizarro's arrival. A healer named Don Carlos Quispe, who had successfully treated several Spanish soldiers, was accused of using demonic powers. The trial records, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Sevilla, show that Spanish authorities tortured Quispe until he confessed to serving the devil. He was executed by burning at the stake in the main square of Cuzco, with Spanish officials forcing indigenous people to witness the execution as a warning. This misunderstanding had deadly consequences that escalated rapidly. As early as the 1540s, Spanish authorities began systematically executing indigenous practitioners throughout the Viceroyalty of Peru. They claimed these individuals were witches, serving the devil, and threatening Spanish colonial interests. The executed people were often respected healers and community leaders who had maintained traditional knowledge for generations. Their deaths weakened indigenous social structures and created martyrs for resistance movements. The pattern became clear by the 1550s. Spanish settlers would fall ill, indigenous healers would provide treatment, and if the patient recovered, the healer would be accused of witchcraft. If the patient died, the healer would still be accused of causing the death through supernatural means. This created a no-win situation for indigenous practitioners who continued their traditional work. Spanish authorities justified these executions through legal frameworks that classified indigenous spiritual practices as heretical. The Council of the Indies, which governed Spanish colonial policy,
issued specific instructions in 1542 stating that any indigenous person who practices ceremonies or uses herbs to influence health or fortune shall be considered a witch and punished accordingly. These policies reflected European fears about witchcraft that had been codified during the medieval period. The first major witchcraft trial in the Andes occurred in 1548 in the town of Huamanga, modern Ayacucho. A respected healer named Maria Chucto was accused of causing the death of a Spanish merchant through supernatural means. The trial records, discovered in the municipal archives in 2003, revealed that Maria had been treating the merchant for fever using traditional methods. When he died, Spanish authorities claimed she had poisoned him with enchanted herbs. Maria was tortured for 3 days before confessing to witchcraft. She was executed publicly, and her body was displayed as a warning to other indigenous practitioners. These early encounters established patterns that would persist throughout the colonial period. Spanish fear of indigenous spiritual power became institutionalized through legal and religious frameworks. Indigenous practitioners found themselves caught between their traditional obligations to their communities and the constant threat of Spanish persecution. The few healers who survived learned to practice more secretly, but the overall effect was to drive indigenous spiritual knowledge underground and fragment traditional medical practices. The psychological impact on indigenous communities was profound. Many people began to fear seeking traditional treatment, worried that healers might be arrested or killed. This fear weakened the transmission of traditional knowledge from elders to younger generations. Some communities stopped practicing certain rituals entirely, leading to the loss of irreplaceable cultural knowledge. The trauma of witnessing public executions created lasting psychological scars that affected indigenous communities for generations. Spanish military leaders also contributed to escalating tensions through their own misunderstandings. Hernando de Soto, who explored the region in the 1540s, wrote that indigenous peoples worshiped the devil openly and make sacrifices to him for victory in war. He ordered the destruction of indigenous sacred sites and the arrest of spiritual leaders, not understanding that these practices were central to indigenous social and political organization. These actions provoked resistance that Spanish authorities interpreted as further evidence of demonic influence.
The Catholic Church became involved in these conflicts through the work of early missionaries. Dominican friars who arrived in the 1530s attempted to convert indigenous peoples while simultaneously investigating their spiritual practices. Friar Vicente Valverde, who accompanied Pizarro, wrote that indigenous ceremonies were satanic rituals designed to deceive the faithful. His reports to church authorities in Spain helped establish the theological justification for persecuting indigenous practitioners. By the 1550s, a complex system of mutual fear had developed between Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples. Spanish settlers feared indigenous spiritual power while simultaneously relying on indigenous healers for medical treatment. Indigenous practitioners feared Spanish persecution while continuing to serve their community's medical needs. This tension created a volatile situation where minor incidents could escalate into major conflicts. The economic impact of these early encounters was also significant. Indigenous healers who were executed or imprisoned represented a loss of valuable medical knowledge for their communities. Spanish settlers who avoided indigenous treatment often suffered worse health outcomes, as European medical knowledge was poorly adapted to Andean conditions. The disruption of traditional healing networks weakened both indigenous and Spanish communities, creating a public health crisis that colonial authorities struggled to address.
One crucial figure in this story was Juan de Betanzos, a Spanish chronicler who married into Inca nobility and became one of the few Europeans to gain intimate knowledge of indigenous spiritual beliefs. Born in Spain around 1510, Betanzos arrived in Peru in 1535 as part of the first wave of Spanish settlers. His marriage to Chimpu Ocllo, sister of the last Inca emperor Huayna Capac, gave him unprecedented access to indigenous perspectives on supernatural beliefs that no other Spanish observer possessed. Betanzos spent decades documenting indigenous customs, and spiritual practices. His major work, Narrative of the Incas, completed in 1590 but not published until 1880, contains detailed descriptions of indigenous spiritual systems that reveal their sophistication and complexity. Betanzos recorded that Andean peoples distinguished carefully between beneficial and harmful spiritual practices, using specific terms that reflected nuanced understanding of different types of practitioners and their roles in society. According to Betanzos' accounts, indigenous peoples had specific terms for different types of spiritual practitioners that reflected their systematic approach to supernatural knowledge. Paco referred to general spiritual practitioners who worked with natural forces. Yachak meant knower and referred to individuals with specialized knowledge of plants, stars, or sacred geography. Hampi were specifically healers who worked with medicinal plants and spiritual forces to cure illness. Amaru were practitioners who worked with serpent spirits and underground forces. These distinctions show that indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated taxonomies for understanding different types of spiritual knowledge. Betanzos' writings demonstrate that indigenous peoples were not simply superstitious, but had developed systematic approaches to understanding and regulating supernatural power. They recognized that spiritual knowledge could be used for good or ill, and they had established social mechanisms for identifying and controlling dangerous practitioners. Their approach was methodical rather than chaotic, based on generations of observation and experience. Betanzos documented that indigenous communities had established clear social rules governing spiritual practitioners. He wrote that, "No one may practice spiritual arts without the permission of the community elders, and those who abuse their powers are punished severely." These rules included requirements for training, community approval, and accountability for results. Communities maintained detailed records of practitioners' effectiveness and punished those who caused harm through incompetence or malice. Another important figure was Bartolomé de las Casas, the famous defender of indigenous rights whose advocacy had profound impact on colonial policy toward indigenous spiritual practices. Born in Seville in 1484, Las Casas arrived in the Americas in 1502 and became one of the most influential voices in Spanish colonial policy. His short account of the destruction of the Indies, published in 1552, included extensive criticism of Spanish treatment of indigenous spiritual practitioners. Las Casas argued that Spanish accusations of witchcraft often targeted innocent people who were simply practicing traditional healing and spiritual customs. He pointed out that many accused individuals were respected community leaders who had provided valuable services to both indigenous and Spanish populations. In a letter to King Charles V written in 1544, Las Casas wrote that the indigenous people are not witches but wise men who possess knowledge that could benefit all humanity if properly understood. Las Casas documented numerous cases where indigenous healers had successfully treated Spanish patients, only to be accused of witchcraft afterward. He described one case in which an indigenous healer named Juan Tupac had cured several Spanish soldiers of severe fevers using traditional methods. When the soldiers recovered, Spanish authorities arrested Tupac and charged him with sorcery. Las Casas intervened personally to secure Tupac's release, but similar cases continued throughout the viceroyalty.
Las Casas's warnings went largely unheeded by Spanish colonial authorities who viewed his advocacy as dangerous to colonial stability. Spanish colonial society was built on hierarchy and control, with indigenous peoples relegated to subordinate status. Authorities preferred to see indigenous peoples as dangerous rather than innocent, as this attitude justified their subjugation and made witchcraft accusations a useful tool for maintaining social order. Despite his influence at the Spanish court, Las Casas had limited success in changing colonial practices. The Council of the Indies continued to issue instructions authorizing the persecution of indigenous spiritual practitioners. However, his advocacy did lead to some modifications in procedure, including requirements for more careful investigation of witchcraft accusations and prohibitions against using torture to extract confessions from indigenous defendants. The tension between Las Casas's humanitarian approach and colonial authorities' practical concerns created ongoing conflicts throughout the colonial period. Colonial officials argued that indigenous spiritual practices posed genuine threats to Spanish security and Christian conversion efforts. Las Casas countered that these fears were based on misunderstanding rather than evidence, and that persecution was counterproductive to colonial goals. As Spanish rule consolidated throughout the 1550s and 1560s, indigenous spiritual practices began to change dramatically in response to colonial pressure. Some practitioners adapted their methods to avoid suspicion by learning to present traditional healing in ways that seemed less threatening to Spanish authorities. Others went underground entirely, practicing secretly in remote areas where Spanish oversight was minimal. This adaptation created new forms of practice that mixed indigenous and Spanish elements in complex ways that confused colonial observers. Some healers began incorporating Christian prayers and saints' names into traditional rituals, hoping to appear more acceptable to Spanish authorities. Others learned to speak Spanish terms for their practices, describing traditional healing as Christian medicine or holy work. These changes allowed them to continue working while appearing to conform to colonial expectations. The process of adaptation was documented in detail by several chroniclers who observed indigenous communities during this period. Agustín de Zárate, who served as a royal accountant in Peru from 1558 to 1565, wrote that indigenous healers have learned to speak of Christ and the Virgin while performing their ancient ceremonies, making it difficult to distinguish between true faith and pagan practice. His observations reveal the sophistication of indigenous responses to colonial pressure. However, this adaptation also created confusion for Spanish authorities, who struggled to distinguish between genuine conversion and strategic accommodation. They worried that indigenous peoples were secretly maintaining dangerous practices while appearing to accept Christianity. This suspicion made witchcraft accusations more likely, as authorities became increasingly paranoid about hidden indigenous resistance. The psychological impact on indigenous communities was profound, as traditional healers found themselves caught between two worlds. They needed to maintain community trust while avoiding Spanish suspicion, creating impossible choices that affected their ability to serve their communities effectively. Some became more secretive in their practices, conducting ceremonies only at night or in remote locations. Others became more aggressive in defending their practices, arguing that their work was compatible with Christian beliefs. Archaeological evidence supports the historical record of this transformation period. Excavations at indigenous sites from the 1560s and 1570s have revealed ritual objects that combine traditional Andean symbols with Christian imagery. Ceremonial vessels show crosses carved alongside traditional geometric patterns. Burial sites contain both indigenous grave goods and Christian medals or rosaries. These material remains demonstrate the complex process of cultural adaptation that occurred during early colonial times. Indigenous communities also changed their own attitudes toward spiritual practitioners as colonial pressure intensified. Traditional healers who had once worked openly now found themselves subject to constant surveillance and suspicion. Community elders developed new strategies for protecting practitioners, including creating false identities and establishing networks for warning about Spanish investigations. Some communities began to view their spiritual practitioners as political activists rather than simply healers, recognizing that their work had become part of broader resistance to colonial rule. The transformation of indigenous practices also affected the transmission of traditional knowledge. Elders who had once taught openly now had to be more selective about whom they trained. Knowledge that had been shared communally became restricted to trusted individuals. Some communities developed coded languages for discussing spiritual practices, using Christian terminology to refer to traditional concepts. This linguistic adaptation helped preserve knowledge while reducing the risk of discovery by Spanish authorities. Spanish observers documented the sophistication of indigenous adaptation strategies. Cristobal de Molina, a priest who worked in Cuzco from 1550 to 1575, wrote that indigenous peoples have learned to hide their true beliefs behind Christian words, making it impossible for us to know what they truly believe. His frustration reveals the effectiveness of indigenous strategies for cultural survival under colonial pressure. The Catholic Church also struggled to respond to these transformations. Missionaries found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine Christian converts and indigenous peoples who were practicing traditional beliefs under Christian cover. This confusion led to more intensive investigation of suspected practitioners and harsher treatment of those who were accused of maintaining traditional practices. Colonial law included specific provisions for witchcraft cases that were designed to address European concerns about sorcery and demonic practice. The Crown had issued detailed instructions about how colonial authorities should handle accusations of sorcery and demonic practice, drawing on centuries of European legal tradition about witchcraft. These laws assumed European patterns of witchcraft and tried to apply them to Andean conditions, often with disastrous results. The legal framework was established through several key documents. The Laws of Bourges, 1512, and the New Laws, 1542, contained provisions about indigenous spiritual practices, though these early laws were relatively lenient. The more severe ordinances of 1573, issued by King Philip II, established harsh penalties for indigenous spiritual practices and gave colonial authorities broad powers to investigate and punish suspected witches. These laws reflected growing Spanish fears about indigenous resistance and the perceived threat of demonic influence in the colonies. Colonial judges found these laws difficult to apply because of fundamental differences between European and Andean concepts of spiritual practice. European witchcraft was typically understood as individual and secretive, involving pacts with the devil and malevolent magic. Andean spiritual practices were often communal and public, involving community ceremonies and collective participation in sacred rituals. European witches were usually isolated figures who worked alone. Andean practitioners were often respected community members who served important social functions. This mismatch created legal confusion that colonial judges struggled to resolve. They had difficulty determining what constituted evidence of witchcraft because European legal standards were poorly adapted to Andean conditions. Spanish legal procedures assumed that witchcraft involved individual sin and demonic pact, while indigenous spiritual practices were understood as collective religious expression. This fundamental difference made it nearly impossible to apply European legal concepts to indigenous cases. Judges often relied on torture to extract confessions from indigenous defendants because they could not obtain evidence through normal legal procedures. The use of torture was authorized by Spanish law for witchcraft cases, but colonial judges applied it more broadly than European courts. They accepted testimony that would be rejected in European courts, including dreams, visions, and supernatural experiences as evidence of guilt. The result was a legal system that was harsher and more arbitrary than its European models. The use of torture in colonial witchcraft cases was documented in numerous trial records that survive in Spanish and Peruvian archives. One typical case from 1578 involved an indigenous healer named Catalina Quispe, who was accused of causing the death of a Spanish settler. When she denied the charges, colonial authorities subjected her to various forms of torture, including the strapado, hanging by the arms, and the boot, crushing the legs. After 3 days of torture, Catalina confessed to serving the devil and was executed. Her trial record notes that the torture was considered necessary because indigenous people do not confess the truth without severe pain.
The Catholic Church also struggled with these cases because indigenous spiritual practices did not fit European categories of religious belief. Inquisitors sent to the Americas found practices that were neither clearly Christian nor obviously demonic according to European standards. They debated whether indigenous spiritual practices were demonic, superstitious, or simply misunderstood by Spanish observers. These theological debates continued for decades without clear resolution, creating legal uncertainty that colonial authorities often resolved through harsh punishment. The Inquisition established a permanent presence in Lima in 1570 specifically to investigate cases involving indigenous spiritual practices. The first inquisitor, Alonso de Montufar, spent years studying indigenous customs and concluded that many practices were superstitious but not necessarily demonic. His moderate approach was overruled by his superiors in Spain, who insisted that all non-Christian practices were inherently dangerous and must be eliminated. The legal framework also created jurisdictional conflicts between different colonial authorities. Civil courts, ecclesiastical courts, and the Inquisition all claimed authority over witchcraft cases, leading to confusion about proper procedures and penalties. Indigenous defendants might face multiple trials for the same alleged crimes, with different courts reaching different conclusions about guilt or innocence. This legal chaos made it nearly impossible for indigenous practitioners to receive fair treatment under colonial law. Spanish legal theory assumed that indigenous peoples were incapable of true religious belief and therefore more susceptible to demonic influence. This assumption justified harsh treatment of indigenous spiritual practitioners and made it easier for colonial authorities to ignore due process requirements. Legal documents from the period frequently refer to indigenous defendants as incapable of understanding Christian truth and therefore more likely to be deceived by the devil.
The practical effect of this legal framework was to create a system where indigenous spiritual practitioners had virtually no legal protection. They could be accused, investigated, and punished based on evidence that would be inadmissible in European courts. The combination of harsh laws, confused procedures, and prejudicial attitudes toward indigenous peoples created a deadly environment for traditional practitioners. Witchcraft trials varied significantly across different parts of the Andes, reflecting differences in Spanish settlement patterns, indigenous population density, and local political conditions. In areas with strong Spanish settlement, accusations were more common and trials more severe. In remote regions where Spanish control was weak, traditional practices often continued with less interference. The density of Spanish population seemed to correlate directly with the intensity of persecution, as colonial authorities had more resources and motivation to investigate suspected practitioners. The coastal regions around Lima developed distinct patterns of witchcraft persecution that differed from highland areas. Urban witchcraft cases often involved Spanish settlers accusing each other of using supernatural means to gain business advantages or harm rivals. Indigenous cases were handled differently, with more emphasis on public spectacle and less attention to legal procedure. The city's mixed population of Spanish settlers, indigenous peoples, and African slaves created unique tensions that influenced how supernatural accusations were investigated and punished. Lima, as the colonial capital, became a center for developing legal precedents that influenced witchcraft trials throughout the viceroyalty. The city's audiencia, High Court, issued numerous rulings about proper procedures for investigating indigenous spiritual practices. These decisions often reflected the practical concerns of urban colonial administration rather than theological concerns about demonic influence. Lima's judges were more likely to consider economic motivations behind witchcraft accusations and to question the reliability of evidence obtained through torture. The coastal valleys around Lima showed different patterns again. In areas with large indigenous populations working on Spanish haciendas, witchcraft accusations often arose from conflicts between indigenous workers and Spanish overseers. Indigenous practitioners who challenged Spanish authority or who were seen as leaders of resistance movements faced particular danger.
The plantation system created unique power dynamics that influenced how supernatural accusations were used to maintain social control. Cuzco, as the former Inca capital, became a special focus of colonial concern about indigenous spiritual practices. Spanish authorities were particularly suspicious of Inca nobility and their spiritual advisors, worrying that traditional practices might fuel political resistance to Spanish rule. This suspicion led to some of the most dramatic witchcraft trials in colonial history, including the famous case of the Inca witches in 1565. The Cuzco trials of 1565 involved accusations against several members of the former Inca nobility who were alleged to have used supernatural powers to resist Spanish authority. The defendants included Don Carlos Inca, grandson of Huayna Capac, and several high-ranking indigenous officials. Spanish authorities claimed that these individuals had performed ceremonies to call upon ancestral spirits for help in overthrowing Spanish rule. The trial lasted 6 months and involved extensive torture of defendants and witnesses. Trial records from the Cuzco case revealed the complexity of colonial fears about indigenous spiritual practices. Spanish authorities were not simply concerned about religious heresy, but about political resistance that they believed was supported by supernatural power. They worried that indigenous ceremonies could inspire rebellion and that spiritual leaders could coordinate resistance across different communities. These concerns led to harsher treatment of high-status indigenous defendants than of common practitioners. The outcome of the Cuzco trials had far-reaching consequences for indigenous communities throughout the Andes. Several defendants were executed publicly, while others were imprisoned for life. The Spanish crown used the trials to justify increased military presence in indigenous communities and more intensive supervision of traditional practices. It became a precedent that colonial authorities cited when investigating other suspected practitioners. The highland communities showed different patterns again, with variations depending on local conditions and Spanish administrative structures. In areas dominated by indigenous populations, traditional practices often continued more openly because Spanish authorities had fewer resources for persecution. These regions became refuges for practitioners who faced danger elsewhere, leading to the preservation of traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The southern highlands around Lake Titicaca developed particularly strong traditions of resistance to colonial interference with indigenous spiritual practices. Communities in this region had maintained greater autonomy during the Inca period and were better organized to resist Spanish control. Indigenous leaders established networks for warning about Spanish investigations and for protecting practitioners who were under suspicion. Archaeological evidence from the southern highlands supports historical accounts of continued traditional practices during colonial times. Excavations at sites from the late 1500s have revealed ceremonial objects that show no Christian influence, suggesting that some communities maintained purely traditional practices. Burial sites from this period contain traditional grave goods and show no evidence of Christian burial practices, indicating that some indigenous peoples continued to practice their traditional religion in secret. The northern highlands around Cajamarca showed different patterns influenced by the region's role in the conquest. This area had been the site of Atahualpa's capture and had experienced particularly harsh Spanish treatment during the early colonial period. Indigenous communities in this region developed sophisticated strategies for hiding traditional practices and for presenting them as Christian when necessary.
Mining regions throughout the Andes developed unique patterns of witchcraft persecution related to labor conditions and economic pressures. Indigenous workers in silver mines often turned to traditional spiritual practices for protection against dangerous working conditions. Spanish mine owners frequently accuse these practitioners of using supernatural powers to cause accidents or to steal precious metals. These accusations provided convenient explanations for mining disasters and justified harsh treatment of indigenous workers. The Potosi mining region became notorious for its harsh treatment of indigenous spiritual practitioners. Spanish authorities claimed that indigenous workers were using supernatural powers to curse Spanish mining operations and to cause cave-ins and other accidents.
These accusations led to numerous executions and created a climate of fear that affected indigenous communities throughout the mining region. Trial record from Potosi revealed the economic motivations behind many witchcraft accusations, as Spanish mine owners used supernatural charges to suppress indigenous resistance to harsh working conditions. Regional variations also reflected differences in the approach of individual colonial administrators. Some governors and judges took more moderate approaches to indigenous spiritual practices, while others pursued aggressive persecution campaigns. The personality and background of local officials often determined the intensity of witchcraft persecution in their jurisdictions. The impact of regional variations extended beyond individual cases to influence broader patterns of indigenous cultural survival. Communities in areas with less intense persecution were able to preserve more traditional knowledge and to maintain stronger connections to pre-colonial spiritual practices. These regional differences created a patchwork of cultural adaptation that affected indigenous communities differently depending on their geographic location and local colonial administration. Disease played a crucial role in escalating witchcraft fears. European diseases devastated indigenous populations throughout the 1500s and 1600s. Spanish colonists also suffered from unfamiliar illnesses. When people fell sick or died without clear cause, supernatural explanations became attractive. Spanish authorities often blamed indigenous practitioners for disease outbreaks. They claimed that shamans were using supernatural powers to harm Spanish settlers. This accusation provided a convenient explanation for deaths that had natural causes. It also justified harsh persecution of indigenous healers. Indigenous communities sometimes blamed Spanish colonists for their suffering. Some practitioners claimed they could fight back against colonial oppression through supernatural means. These claims frightened Spanish authorities and led to more accusations. The cycle of fear and persecution intensified during epidemic periods. Medical knowledge was limited in colonial times. People could not distinguish between infectious disease and poisoning. They could not differentiate between natural death and supernatural harm. This ignorance made witchcraft accusations seem reasonable to many observers. Witchcraft accusations in the Andes followed patterns seen elsewhere in colonial Spanish America. Women were more likely to be accused than men. Indigenous women faced particular danger, especially those who practiced traditional healing or held positions of authority in their communities. Spanish women also faced accusations, though less frequently. Wealthy Spanish women sometimes used witchcraft charges against rivals. Poor Spanish women were more likely to be victims themselves. The intersection of gender, race, and class created complex patterns of persecution. Indigenous men were not immune from accusations. Male practitioners who challenged Spanish authority faced particular danger. Political leaders who maintained traditional spiritual practices were especially vulnerable. Spanish authorities saw these individuals as threats to colonial order. Social status influenced how cases were handled. Elite individuals often received different treatment than common people. Spanish nobles might face investigation, but rarely execution. Indigenous commoners had little protection against false accusations. Economic factors played a hidden but important role in many witchcraft cases. Accusations could be used to seize property or eliminate business rivals. Indigenous healers who charged fees for their services sometimes faced economic jealousy from Spanish competitors. Land disputes also influenced witchcraft accusations. Spanish colonists who wanted indigenous land sometimes claimed that traditional practitioners were using supernatural powers against them. These accusations provided legal justification for confiscations.